Hi everyone. Today we're going to talk about language development in infancy. So we're going to talk a little bit about the development of hearing and how that relates to early language development and infants' ability to identify sounds and then produce sounds. So it's not surprising to learn that sensory development is really closely connected to language development. So think about sensory development is one of these physical development things, and language development is a cognitive development domain. So these two domains are connected. So one way that sensory development is connected to cognition is through this identification of sounds. So infants attend naturally to speech-like sounds. They're really drawn to the sounds of language. And that's because we as humans are just social creatures. We want to be able to connect with one another. By around 4 months, infants can attend to their own name, so they'll know if somebody's saying their name. And then until about 7 months old, infants can discriminate between all the sounds of different languages of the world. However, this ability goes away by about 10 months, and then we don't get it back again ever. So there's some really interesting research by a psychologist named Janet Worker, and she does work about infants and language development. And I've got a short, about a 5-minute video of hers that I'm going to show you that describes her work. If you have trouble with the video, if the sound sounds a little echoey or something like that, I've also included the link in week 8 module, so you could also just play it in YouTube on your own if you'd like that instead.
Trying to find out what young infants know is quite difficult, as they can't speak and they're notoriously poor at following instructions. So over the years, scientists have developed a number of indirect tasks to probe infant capabilities. The most successful of these tasks take advantage of responses that infants naturally make. And in the conditioned head turn procedure, what we do is we teach babies to turn their head not just when they detect a noise or a sound, but when they detect a change from one sound category to another. It had been shown in previous work that young babies seem to be able to discriminate sounds from any of the world's languages, but that adults, like us, have difficulty hearing sound differences that are not used in our own language. I guess the most famous example there is the difficulty that Japanese adults have hearing the difference between ra and la. So I wanted to know, when does this change occur? And in a series of studies, we ascertained that there are important changes occurring during the first year of life. And that's when we honed in on testing infants of 6 to 8, 8 to 10, and 10 to 12 months of age on their ability to discriminate a native sound distinction, the ba-da, as well as a non-native distinction, in this case, 2 Ds that are used in Hindi but not English, da, da. In the conditioned head turn procedure, the infant sits on their mother's lap in a testing room. Across the table from the mother and infant, an experimental assistant sits and quietly shows the baby toys to keep him or her entertained and focused straight ahead. In the background, they're being presented with sounds. Then after a number of repetitions, the computer operator in the adjacent control room pushes a button on the computer to indicate that it's time to change to a new sound. You teach the child to turn their head every time they detect a sound change. There's a training phase where every trial involves a change from one sound to another with the immediate activation of a reinforcer. Then there's a conditioning phase where you gradually delay turning on the reinforcer, hoping that the child will make an anticipatory head turn. Then after they've reached some kind of criterion, we have 3 consecutive anticipatory head turns, then you go into the testing phase. And in the testing phase, what happens is the computer operator puts the whole procedure under computer control. and all that they do is press a button when they observe that the infant is in a state of readiness. The computer randomly selects either experimental or control trials, and we record the number of hits, and that's a correct head turn to a change trial. Misses, that's when there's been a change trial, it changed from ba to da and the baby did not turn their head, in which case there's no reinforcement. Correct rejections, so that's when the computer selected a control trial, no change, and the baby doesn't turn their head, as is appropriate. And false alarms, and that's when the computer selects a control trial and the baby turns their head even though there's been no change. Again, there's no reinforcement in this case, and that's recorded as a false alarm. At 6 to 8 months of age, an infant hears da over and over again, and now hears the contrasting da come on that I know you as an adult English speaker can't hear, but that 6 to 8 month old English learning baby can hear that difference that is used in Hindi and many other languages of the world. And they turn their head just as regularly to a change from da to da as they do to a change from ba to da. At 10 to 12 months of age, an English learning baby can easily hear the difference between ba and da and turn their head appropriately, but they no longer respond to the difference between the Hindi da da, which a Hindi learning infant of this age can discriminate. They're acting like you and I. They've honed in on the sound categories that are used in their native language, and they're failing to detect a change and not making an appropriate head turn response.
Okay, so it's interesting to know that what's going on here is a critical period for language. There's a critical period for language. And remember when we learned about brain development and synaptogenesis and synaptic pruning? Well, this is the same thing. So what's going on here is that in infancy, there's this synaptogenesis, there's this surge of synaptic growth. And that lets baby recognize, remember we looked at the example of faces, so all the different types of faces. We looked at primate faces, monkey faces. But it also gives baby this ability to be able to hear all these different sounds to prepare baby to understand any language. And so once baby starts to hear a certain language, the pruning occurs, and so then those connections are just put away. Pretty interesting stuff. Okay, so newborns also can distinguish between their mother's voice and other people's voices, and they really prefer the mother's voice to other people's voices. And the way they measure this is kind of interesting. They measure it with a pacifier sucking procedure. So they put a pacifier in baby's mouth, and it's connected electronically to a device, and the device measures how fast or slow the baby is sucking on the pacifier. And so if the baby gets excited, pacifier sucking increases. It gets faster. And so baby's pacifier sucking increases when it's listening to mother's voice. Another interesting thing that infants are attracted to in terms of sound is something that's called infant-directed speech. And this is sometimes called motherese. And what this is this sort of high-pitched, sing-songy tone that we speak to baby in that's kind of like this. Hi, baby, how are you doing? What's going on? Okay, hello. That's kind of motherese. You don't talk to a baby and say, hello, baby. How are you doing? What's going on today? Hello. Babies aren't really as attracted to that tone of voice as they are to motherese. And it turns out that using motherese or infant-directed speech helps children to learn words. They're more likely to learn the words of language if they're spoken to in infant-directed speech. Also, interestingly, most cultures of the world use some form of infant-directed speech to speak to infants. That's not to say all cultures of the world speak using infant-directed speech, but most do. Also, infant-directed speech is different than baby talk. So you might have heard people say, well, I don't baby talk to my baby because I want them to know the right way to say words. And that's true. But infant-directed speech is using proper words. It's just the intonation with which the words are spoken. So maybe if I'm going to point to a bottle, I'll still say, hey, look at the bottle. And and that's infant-directed speech. But if I'm talking baby talk, then I might say, hey, look at the baba. And that's that's not the way that people believe is the best way to develop language development in infancy. Now you have a recording of me saying, look at the baba. Okay, so beyond just learning how things sound, infants also learn how to make sounds with their mouths. And so this is a picture of my lovely niece Flora when she was 4 months old. I think she was about 4 months old in this one. She had some chubby cheekers back then. So when people are speaking, they speak using vowels and consonants. And all languages use a different combination of vowels and consonants. So in English, vowels are A, E, I, O, U, and sometimes Y. And consonants are everything else. Think the S's, the T's, that sorts of thing. Those sorts of things. So infants start to produce sounds during the first year, and they do it using this progression. So it's not important for you guys to know exactly when all of these sound production abilities develop, but just know that they usually develop in this particular order. So first, starting right away on day 1, infants have the ability to cry. They can cry right away. And after that, they start to coo. And then they go into simple articulation, so making different kinds of sounds with their mouth. And the last 2 are the 2 that you might more recognize as sort of pre-lingual sounds. One is babbling, so saying like ba, ba, ma, ma, ma. And the next is pattern speech, so really putting sounds together that sound a little bit like words. So this is the sequence. So this isn't only true for hearing infants, but it's also true for deaf infants. Deaf infants go through this same sequence of crying, cooing, simple articulation, babbling, and pattern speech. It's just that they do it, if they're taught sign language, they do it using sign language. So there's even a way to babble using your hands called manual babbling, which is kind of interesting. Okay, so let's make a connection to something that I saw on the good old internet. So on the internet, I found this article from Mental Floss that said, 10 language mistakes that kids make that are actually pretty smart. Now, I don't know if they're really smart, but they are interesting and they are related to child development. So the first one on the list, and I'll just give you the first one, was dop it instead of stop it. So think back to one slide ago, when infants are learning to produce those sounds. Remember this. So remember they're using vowels and consonants, and they're using a lot of fine motor development. Really, you have to push air through your lips, teeth, and tongue to be able to make these vowel and consonant sounds. So when infants say dop it instead of stop it, what's going on there? So what the problem is an inability to pronounce consonants. Remember, consonants and vowels involve a lot of fine motor development in the mouth, lips, teeth, tongue. And so it's hard to be able to use that fine motor control right away at the beginning to make the ST sound in stop. Stop is a hard thing for your mouth to do. It's not natural. So they just kind of use a shortcut. They use a little shortcut and they say dop it instead of stop it. All right, folks, that's all I have for you today. I hope you have a great day, and I will see you in class.